Greetings, juniors. We are going to spend some time today talking about some of the isms. Um, Really important piece of information for you all to understand in terms of being an effective social worker, but it's about recognizing some of the systems that have already been set up that we have to navigate through and navigate with our clients, sometimes for our own well being as well as those for our clients. So, bear with me. I would ask you to open your minds to look at some of the information that we're about to present here and just think through in terms of how these things apply to you and your life and what they mean and how they might impact how you do your work with clients. All right. So first off, this is a really important piece, and I think it's an important thing for social workers to acknowledge, um, and that is accountability is a very important process for social workers. Um, this is a process that is about taking responsibility for one's own behavior. So, as a social worker, as a human being, you have to take responsibility for your own behavior, the impact that it has on you, and the impact that it has on others. Um, and I would also challenge you all that in the course of the years to come, as you're doing this work, it's really a commitment to first tell the truth about oneself to the best of your ability. And second, it is a commitment to take responsible action about doing the right thing. So just let that soak in for just a little bit as we kind of move forward in terms of that whole piece around accountability and think about what that means for you. Now, first off, we're going to jump into this diagram, which might be a little bit hard to see. So I'll probably put a slide in the piece. So as we venture into this whole notion of culture and concept, there are many different definitions for culture. But this particular iceberg um, demonstration, or should I say, presentation, really kind of hits it at an interesting level because when a lot of us think about culture, or most of us think about culture, obviously we've got what we call this surface culture. So when we go visit other countries, when we go to different festivals that are held by different ethnic minority groups and the likes, we normally find ourselves really gravitating towards the food. It's a new experience, the dress, the music, the visual arts, the drama, the craft, and all of these things that are above the surface in terms of what we look at when we think about culture. However, that's relatively low in terms of the emotional load. You know, pictures, artifacts, things of that particular nature. They're nice, they're informative, but they don't really get at what culture really is all about as we think about that. So if you go just below the surface, you'll have in your left-hand column this rule that says unspoken rules. And so there are rules that are part of all cultures, and we don't necessarily talk about them. So the emotional load is very high. So being able to understand these particular dynamics is going to be very important because they exact an emotional toll on your clients. And so things like courtesy, contextual conversation patterns, time, space, facial expressions, body language, touching, eye contact, nonverbal communication. Uh, what a concept of beauty is will vary from culture to culture in terms of those things. Courtship practices, they're very different depending on where you come from. People's relationships with animals, the tempo of work, the concept of food, ideas about child rearing. A lot of these are unspoken rules in the various ethnic and racial communities, but no one really talks about them. Except for within that community, it's understood what that those kind of things actually mean. So, for example, in some parts of some Latino culture, uh, the notion of machismo, which is, you know, the male in the home is the authoritative figure and really speaks for the family. And so, if you are a social worker and you come into a situation where you're doing an interview with a kid and a mom who may be of Latino descent, and dad's not home, they're giving you information, and all of a sudden dad comes home, and then all the information flow stops, and everything is directed towards dad for how things will be answered. Now, in Western culture, we might come to the conclusion like, well, wait a minute, there's something going on. He's very controlling. He potentially may even be an abusive person, but none of that is true. But the culture for that particular group of Latina is that males take the lead in terms of having the conversation about what happened to the family. Doesn't mean that people are being abused, doesn't mean that people are being controlled. It means that that's a cultural aspect that we have to pay attention to. Misreading that from a Western standpoint can have you making assumptions about clients that are totally off base and totally inaccurate. So we have to be careful and we have to learn and study about culture. So that's just one example. As we go further and deeper into the unconscious rules, they're totally below sea level and they're emotionally very intense. So things like attitudes towards elders, patterns of group decision making, the definition of insanity or how people look at mental health issues, the tolerance for physical pain, the concept of self, uh, definitions for obscenity will vary depending on where you are. Attitudes towards dependence, roles of relationships, concepts of cleanliness. All of these are unspoken rules that vary based on the different types of culture that people may be a part of. And these are things that you need to understand and may avail yourself to as a social worker working with these families. What you don't want to do is you don't want to be offensive. I can think of another unspoken rule that I encountered in my days as a social worker going into a Hmong home to do an assessment and to meet, and I had an interpreter with me, and we were about to enter the home. It was in the middle of the winter, and so the interpreter was very clear to say you need to remove your hat and you need to remove your shoes before you go into the home. I'm thinking like, oh, okay, didn't know. And I did that particular piece and I was well received. And when I left, I talked to the interpreter about, so I can kind of get the shoes being removed, but the hat, what is that about? He says, in this particular aspect of Hmong culture, to enter someone's house with your shoes on and to wear your hat is disrespectful to the spirits that protect that particular home. Now, I didn't know that. So if I would have not had that person with me, I would have probably insulted that particular family because I didn't have a clear understanding about what the unspoken rules were and how intense that was. To accept the spirits that guards the house is problematic and would have some implications on my credibility as a social worker moving forward with the family. So those are just a couple of examples from my own personal practice that I have kind of come in contact with as well too. So look at this iceberg concept, study it, really try to get an understanding of what it's like and you're dealing with different cultures and recognize that it's always there and it's always present and it always impacts. Now, as we think about principles of understanding. So we know that we live in a world that is has race, culture, sexual orientation as constant dynamics, and it really impacts how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we see the world around us individually as well as in systems. Um, we also need to understand that these dynamics will empower us or severely limit us in our quest for economic and social justice for all. So, if I have preconceived notions or biases about any of these things as it relates to any of the clients that I work with, then that's going to taint my view in terms of how I see and how I may then respond to those particular individuals. So, again, it's about looking at how can I remain value neutral in terms of being able to work with clients so they get the best possible opportunity to be themselves and for me to understand that in terms of the work that I do with them. So now, when we think about race and racism, we hear a lot about this topic. It's all over the news all the time. Um, and here are some definitions that I'll let you read. And so just to understand what race actually is and what prejudice actually is. All right. So now we're trying to really kind of unpack this whole piece around racism and recognize that race is a socially constructed um, process. Um, Also understanding that we are all socialized into different roles as it relates to how we develop through a racial lens. So there are two concepts that are going to be really important: internalized racial oppression and internalized racial superiority. Racial oppression is as follows: it's a complex, multi generational socialization process that teaches people of color to believe, accept, and live out negative societal definitions of self. Okay. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have internalized racial superiority. It's a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to behave and accept and live superior societal definitions of self. So you can see I've got a couple of bullets here in terms of um, at the end. So under racial internalized racial oppression, I have this comment that says the nightly news. So it's not uncommon, or it used to not be uncommon for me, but I've since kind of figured out what was happening in this instance. When there was a horrible thing that happened on the news and someone had been hurt or seriously killed, one of the first things that would enter into my mind as an African American male is, oh my God, I hope that wasn't a black person who did this. Now, when you think about that, it just kind of negates the fact that some tragedy has happened in our community, and I really need to be focused on the well-being of that person who's injured. But my first inclination in years past would be to think about, oh my God, I hope it wasn't someone that was a person of color who were black. The rationale behind that in terms of the internalized oppression is that it is one other thing that happens that will demonstrate to white people that they're all the things that we say we are. We're unworthy, we're untrustworthy, all of those things, we're violent, the whole 9 yards. It's false dichotomy, it's false teaching, but you can be socialized into believing that particular piece as well. So on the other end of the spectrum, you see the caption of my annoying colleague. So I had a colleague who was a white woman who was a psychologist, and we worked on a number of different um, groups together. And we were a part of an anti-racism leadership team at one particular point in time. And I noticed that every time we met weekly, when a concept came up or when an idea was put forward, my colleague had to kind of have the last word and had to really kind of expound about her expertise in knowing about this particular subject matter. It got to the point where everybody else in the group was kind of looking around and going like, this is really just kind of annoying. Why do you have to comment? If I say the sky is blue, then you have to give me some scientific explanation why the sky is blue. What is it that you're trying to get at? And I remember after we had a conversation and the group kind of gently confronted her, she went into tears and she described the story. She says, I was raised in a small town in Minnesota, and I was one of five girls. And my parents said to me, under no uncertain terms, that, you will project that you will project that you are superior to all other people. That's what you do. And so, when you leave out of this house, that's my expectation for you in terms of how you conduct yourself when you're in public, when you're interacting with other people. You don't you have the last word, and you make sure that people know that you're present and that you're in the room and that you are smart and you are capable and you can compete. I was taken aback by that particular piece when we all were kind of set back and kind of aghast. But then she realized that, her parents were responding from the times that they were raised when women didn't have a voice, white women didn't have as much of a voice. And so this was their way of trying to overcompensate. But in the end, she found herself being fairly off putting and annoying but it was all about how she was taught to come from this place of superiority. So those are just two examples that really kind of help you think about when we talk about internalized racial oppression, internalized racial superiority, about how it plays itself out. And it's something that's true for all of us to some degree. All right. We're talking about historical trauma. So recognizing that there is generational trauma that when certain groups of people were targeted, uh, whether here in the United States or around the world, and those particular types of trauma are result in soul wounds, and it actually continues to be transmitted through the generations in terms of how we actually interface with larger systems that have a history of not being supportive for people who are a minority status or who are marginalized and oppressed or BIPOC. So things just to keep in mind in terms of that when you see some of the things happening for clients or groups of people. White privilege really can be a difficult concept for a lot of persons who are white to actually grasp. It's the idea or the notion that your white skin gives you privilege, it gives you advantage, it gives you immunity to certain things in our society. Um, it's a common advantage to all others, an exemption in particular cases from certain burdens or liabilities. I have talked with people who were persons who were white and talked about, what kind of things have to happen if I'm pulled over for a traffic stop in terms of being an African American male. There's a different protocol in terms of how I need to respond, how I need to act, because it's a matter of safety and could potentially be a matter of life and death. Or I have to entertain and talk to some of my colleagues who are white who talk about getting pulled over all the time and having a laughing conversation and being let go with a warning. Um, Most of the time, or some people have never gotten tickets and have been pulled over on multiple occasions, but the common denominator is that the police officer and the person who was pulled over are actually white. That's a form of privilege that we don't always think about in terms of kind of how things play themselves out in this particular world. So we'll spend some more time when you're in your understanding systems of privilege and oppression, really kind of unpacking this whole notion of white privilege. It's something that is. It's not something that people who are white ask for, but you have. And with that comes a responsibility. And for those people who are not white or have white skin privilege, then we recognize right away that these are privileges that we do not have. So just something to wrap your head around in terms of that. LGBTQAI. Does anybody know what that stands for? All right. We're talking about this particular diagram because oftentimes people have a lot of confusion or there's a lot of moral implications for having conversations about sexuality, gender identification, the whole nine yards. And so this is a diagram that I think can be helpful in terms of helping people understand who may just not have knowledge about this particular community. And it looks at how we talk about gender identity. It talks about orientation. Uh, it looks at gender expression, and it looks at biological sex. So this particular presentation illustrates that all of these things exist on a continuum. So when we think about gender identity, some people identify as male, some people identify as women. But in the middle of the continuum, you have genderqueer or genderqueer. So gender identity is about how it is in your head, how you think about yourself, um, what it means to be who it is you are. All right. Gender expression is how you show up or how you demonstrate your gender. How do you dress? How do you show up in the world? You can be everywhere on a continuum from masculine to feminine or androgynous, where you're in between or you don't pick one particular way to present yourself in the world as another. Then we have, and that's your gender expression. Your biological sex, you can identify as cisgender as a male or cisgender as a female or non-binary or intersex. So there's a continuum again in terms of how people show up in the world. And then your sexual orientation is who you are physically, spiritually, and emotionally attracted to based on their sex or gender in relation to your own. So we have on one end of the spectrum, heterosexual up to homosexual and then bisexual. So these are things that you need to be aware of in terms of the clients that you will be working with, because you will be working with folks who identify along these particular lines, and your job is to treat them with the dignity and respect that they deserve, and to make sure that you are there to provide the services that they need to change their lives in a positive way. Not for you to take a moral high road or tone about things that you don't understand or about denouncing who people actually are. It's very harmful and it's very destructive. All right. So, thinking about this really short presentation, think about writing down your immediate thoughts and feelings and insights about what you just heard and seen. What was new to you? What was your aha moment? What do you do next in terms of where do you go from here? All right. So, that brings to a end this brief little section on some of the isms, and we'll again talk much more about those in the coming weeks. So enjoy and see you in class.